Reading in a foreign language is really, really hard. I am someone who has been fascinated by reading in different languages for many, many years now. It all started with Japanese, when I sort of became fascinated by this idea of reading novels and literature in Japanese. It was just so fascinating to sort of hold these books in my hand and seeing all of the kanji and Chinese characters, all this like running, vertically right to left down the pages. I loved how small Japanese novels tend to be and holding them. And I just had this fantasy of being able to read those for pleasure in my own time. Now later when I started French, this actually became kind of a fascination. I can't describe how many hours I spent just like desperately trying to become able to read novels in French. And the funny thing is, growing up, I didn't really like to read. It's not something I enjoyed, and I only did it when I was forced to in school. But now it's actually one of my favorite things to do, and I can't imagine my life without the joy of reading. And this all happened to me in foreign languages, but in particular with French, because French is the first language that I actually managed to read a book all the way through from start to finish in more or less one really long sitting, which for me is really an accomplishment because I am a very slow reader in general, and I had never done that even in English. And so honestly, some of the loveliest, delightful moments of my language learning, and even in my life, honestly, have happened reading books in foreign languages. So this is a topic I'm extremely passionate about. And one of my favorite things to do on this channel is to try to share advice, techniques, methods, perspectives that you may not have heard before. As always, if you like this video, or if you want to see more of my advice and tips and adventures, then please do subscribe, leave me a comment and a like. Jumping in, so going back a few years, I had always, approached reading in foreign languages with kind of a brute force method. In French, it's funny, one of the ways that I found most effective to learn to read in a foreign language was by essentially reading the first 5 or 10 pages of a lot of novels. And it wasn't like a crafted, beautiful method that I had. It was just that I was so determined to finally just get through a novel that I would read the first 10 pages and it would just be maddeningly difficult. I would write down all the words and phrases. It was a very intensive approach to reading. But then I would sort of switch. I would say, okay, you know what? This one's too difficult. Maybe I can actually try this one over here. That one seems really nice. It would be inviting me with its beautiful cover design, and it seemed so nice and friendly until I read the first 10 pages of that one. And I just did this process over and over again. I kept changing books and just reading the first 10 or 15 or 20 pages. And that's what happened, is that 10 became 20, and the next thing you know, I was reading 30 pages or 40 pages, until finally I managed to sort of scratch my way all the way through my very first novel in French. And so what happened is that every time I was sort of starting a new novel in French, I was actually accumulating lots of words and phrases, and it worked, but this is very much a brute force method. And I think that to succeed with those kinds of methodologies, you have to really be somebody who has an iron willpower. Now, a couple of years ago, I started a new series on this channel about reading my very first novel in Spanish. And I have to say, it was one of my favorite series. I really enjoyed it. It's a couple years old now, but I do recommend checking it out if you're curious. Now, in that series, I made one of the biggest discoveries of my own language learning career regarding reading real time, and I want to share that with you now. So I developed a 3-step process. Now, the process itself is not super important. You don't have to follow the process, but I want to share what I learned from doing it. What I would do is I would read the first chapter of a book all the way through without really stopping or pausing for a dictionary. And I just wanted to see how much could I understand just off of reading it all the way through. Now, you may be familiar with this kind of approach where people sort of say, you do this sort of extensive reading approach where you just read without a dictionary and you try to guess the meaning of things, and you just hope that through lots of exposure and lots of repetition of key vocabulary, you'll eventually sort of acquire lots and lots of words. Now, in my experience, this actually often doesn't work. People very often end up getting overwhelmed by the content. It's extremely difficult, and people end up saying things like, you need to understand 90 or 95% of the words for that approach to be really effective. So here's the key. That is not where I stopped. I read the first chapter all the way through, and in this case, with the Spanish novel I was reading, I remember it was very, very hard. I felt like I understood maybe 50% at best. And in the video, you can see that I'm kind of just exhausted after trying it out. So then came step 2, where I went back and I actually did an intensive approach on that first chapter. So I started with kind of an extensive reading approach where I just read it all the way through, but then I went back and I did a really intensive study of that first chapter. So what happened is, after I did that really intensive study of chapter 1, and you could argue that yes, it's time consuming and this is why people don't often do intensive reading, but I ended up with a really solid understanding of the context. I knew who the characters were, I knew sort of what was going on. The first chapter is typically where the author is setting up the story, the context, the environments. It's a really key chapter for you to understand. So then I read chapter 2, and that is where the magic really happened. I found that when I did my first step in chapter 2, where I sort of read it all the way through from start to finish without stopping, I understood like 80 to 85%. It was absolutely incredible. I went from like 50% the first time to like 85 or maybe even 90% the second time. I remember that I was just mind blown. This is not something I expected. And the more I thought about it, I realized that when you're reading a book, so much of what's going on, it's like keeping track of who is who, which characters are what or who, and what they're doing, what their backstories are, what is the general storyline. And so much of that context is built up and explained in that first chapter. Now, what I have found through trying this out many, many, many times is that very often when you're struggling through a book and you just read it from start to finish, or that's the goal, without ever stopping for any sort of intensive study, then yes, unless you're able to understand a really high percentage of what's going on, you just end up lost and you don't really know exactly who is who, what the main story is. You sort of forget, or you never really knew what the main plot even was. And so you end up spending so much time just trying to figure out the fundamentals of this book. But it turns out that most of that core information is actually set up in some way, shape, or form in that first chapter. And so essentially my big tip here is whatever you do, whether it's an intensive or extensive approach or some kind of combination, whatever you do, at least take the time to take an intensive study approach to the first chapter. Because this means that you will know like who the main characters are, what their sort of setup is, or maybe their backstory, what the general plot is, what is the general scene, where is the story taking place. You'll know all these important things so that when you proceed to chapter 2 and onwards, you don't have to wonder about those things. You have this sort of anchor that you can grab onto. And it's amazing how much that frees you up to just focus on enjoying the story and trying to keep track. And so that's basically it. I think that one of the most important things you can do to set yourself up for success when reading a book or a novel or even an article in a foreign language is take that first unit, and in a book that's often a chapter, and really take the time to study that one chapter in lots of detail. I would even take notes, even if you take them in English or your native language. Take some notes on who are the main characters, what are their backstories that you know so far, where did they come from, where does the story take place. Just take some notes that will help sort of be a map that you can refer back to all the way throughout the story. And I think that this will just really relieve your cognitive load from constantly just trying to figure out what the heck is going on, and you can focus on trying to keep up. And personally, I really recommend this approach of sort of like reading it one time all the way through without stopping, going back and trying to sort of intensively study the chapter and then move on, and sort of every now and again come back and maybe review those notes. What I would do is I actually used to use a highlighter, and I would highlight words that repeated so I could actually see over time all the words that had come up again and again and again. Anyway, I could talk a lot about different methods and techniques for reading in foreign languages, but I wanted this video to really focus on just one absolutely crucial thing you can do that I think will make all the difference in actually finishing books in a foreign language and not just starting them.